Hi everyone, welcome to Mumsu Code video guide session. In the previous video, we were looking at the storage broker where we wrote a method about selecting a particular record on an ID. So this is going green, and in today's video, we're going to work on this particular layer where the request that is coming in, we're going to validate everything. If everything looks good, we're going to call the broker. If at all there's any other errors happening, we're going to handle that and then wrap it up according to the localization and categorization standard we are following, and then give it back to the caller. So this is going to be our retrieve, that's the language at the foundation layer. Let's get to the coding. Okay, so this is going to be the fail and pass test. So let's open up our foundations. We are here at the sample. As usual, let's go write our contract. This is going to be sample, and I'm going to say retrieve sample by ID, and it's going to take an ID as an input. Okay, now the method. So this is going to turn red. Let me implement it. Let me minimize. Okay, and since this is a single line, I'm going to scope it out in this way. Our foundation is ready. Let's go write our failing test. So I'm going to add a class sample service test dot logic dot retrieve ID. So this is going to be my file name. I missed the CS. I don't know if it's going to accept. Yes. Okay. Then here we are with the, okay, I think I messed up. So let me delete it. Delete, right click, class. So this is going to be sample service test dot logic dot retrieve by ID dot CS. Okay, yeah, now it gave me the header, and then this is going to be my PowerShell class. Okay, Control K. So what are we going to do first? The happy path, right? So fact, and this. So this is going to be public, and the method is not going to, return anything. So it's a void. And what it's going to do? It should do something. What it should do? It should retrieve sample by ID. So this is the test name. Our structure is given when and then. As usual, I am starting with the when section. So this is going to be, it's going to return me a sample record, be my actual sample. Test that I'm focusing on is sample service dot retrieve sample ID and input sample dot. Let's come here. I can break this one, resolving the namespace. Okay, so this is my focus of test. Let me go prepare the sample. So what I'm going to say here is random sample equal create random sample. I think by this time you already know, right, the wording that we have to use in the variable name that will make sense. And I'm going to prepare my sample. Now what I'm going to do, whenever this particular method is getting called, underlying, it is going to call the broker. So what will the broker do when the call is received? That is something we got to mock it, right? So for me to mock, I'm going to say this storage broker mock dot setup broker. That I'm going to mock is select by ID. I'm going to say if you are receiving a call, with input sample.id. Okay, it's auto completing. Then you return me something. What I want is I don't want to return input. I want to give more meaningful name. So sample storage sample equal input sample. There's a call to the storage broker with this particular ID. Return what is there in the storage. Okay. Now I have my actual sample. I need to validate it against with something, right? So let me prepare my expected sample equal storage sample. And then we wanted to have a reference. So I'm going to declone it. Okay. So now what am I going to validate? My expectation is this one should be equivalent to library here. Yeah, fluent assertion. Okay. Now I have validated the data that is coming back. Not just that. Next, I'm going to validate the dependency call. This is the core dependency, right? The functionality is expecting to call the broker to retrieve the records. Dot select by ID input ID. How much times should it be called? I want it to be called exactly once. You call me once, I give you the record, and the deal is done. Okay. The core functionality is verified. So we want to verify all of the dependency calls. So I'm going to say this dot storage broker mock VNO. I don't want any other calls to be landing to the broker. And the other dependency that we have is our logging broker. Okay, so our test is ready. Right click, run the test. My expectation is not implemented. Okay, here we are. Analyze, run, code cleanup. Okay, it's done. Good. So here goes our first failing test. Before that, users Shri foundations retrieve sample by ID. And it's going to be my failing test. Nice. Let's go make it pass. And here we are. So taking this line away, the expectation is I need to call the storage broker. And what should I do? Pass it. And whatever this one returns, I'm just going to return it back to the caller of this method. That's it. Let's open up. Yeah, this one here, right click, run the test. It should be happy now. Yeah, it's happy. Going fast because you are all now so much well versed on what you're doing. Okay, so here we are. If you take a look at the pattern, what we have done is logic has the happy path. And then we're going to write the validations. In retrieval, we didn't even have any validation because there's no input parameter. But here we do have one input parameter, that is ID, right? So let me right click class sample service test dot. This is going to be my validations and retrieve by ID.cs. Think that it's easy to copy paste and rename, and I don't have to do all the namespaces here, clean up and all those things. But as I said, it's better you write the code at the initial phases, and once you know what you're writing, it's going to be an easy thing for you to later on skip typing all the thing if at all you need. Okay, so here we are. This is going to be again a test. So this public void, it should do something. What it should do, it should throw validation on what operation? on retrieve by ID. But when? Should it throw always? Not really, right? If ID is invalid, only when it's invalid, I want it to throw an error. Okay, here comes our sections. Now this is going to be my action, right? This one, I'm going to call it as retrieve by ID action. I want to call it as action or task, whichever way you want. And then I'm going to defer the execution. My scope of test is this dot service retrieve, and this is going to be my invalid ID, right? So invalid. Stop that autocomplete. Invalid ID. Okay. Now what we need to do? We need to go prepare this. So let me say var invalid sample. I want it to be, all empty, right? You can actually create a random sample and then make it invalid, or you can do something like this, which it initializes with all the basic default values. Okay, so next one is I'm going to prepare my exception that it is getting thrown. So that is something that I want to validate, right? So invalid sample exception equal invalid sample exception. So this is going to be my inner layer. So do we have this one? Yeah. When you're writing it for the first time, you'll have to end up creating all the exceptions. As you go along, it's going to be easy because you have already created all these entities. Okay, now I'm going to prepare the messaging. So what I'm going to say is add data. This is the parameter that I'm working on. This is going to be my sample.id, and the message that I want to give is ID is required. Then what do we do generally? We go with our expected. So var expected. Since this is a validation, my wrapper is going to be my entity and validation exception sample validation exception, and this is going to take an inner. That's the localized version of the exception. Okay, good. So simple. I'm here. The first step that I want to do is I want to validate if the error is being thrown. So sample validation exception, and then I say retrieve by ID. So I think retrieve sample by ID is also good, right? Okay. Then what are we expecting? I need to log it. So we can go and say if an error happens, we want to keep a track of it. So logging broker dot verify. I'm going to say broker. What type of logging do we want? We want just an error level logging. Not just that, but I want it to be having the same messages, the same exception as expected. And then this also should be done only once. Error one time, you can log it. So I think names. Okay. Then my core functionality for this particular test is to call the storage broker with that retrieve by ID, right? I really want to verify that is not getting called because error has happened. What is the necessity for us to even go to the next layer? So that is something that we want to verify. So verify broker dot select sample by ID. Now what I want to verify is I don't want this ID to be called. I mean that value to be passed for this method to be called. Not just that, I don't want any other input parameter to be passed for this particular method. So is any of int. That's the data type. I don't want any input value to be passed for this particular column. Times, right? Good. And then, as usual, we go and say verify no other calls. This dot storage broker.env. Take a look as per the workflow order. First comes the logging broker because an error has happened, and then we are verifying the core broker layer that you should not be called. In the same order of execution, we are verifying the no other calls. If you take a look at the previous test that we have written, here this broker dependency is called first. So that's the same order we have verified the no other calls. Okay. If you think this is big enough, I think I can short this one. Right click, run. So I'm expecting that no exception is thrown. It says expected is this, but no exception is thrown. Good. Let's go make a commit. Will be a fail test. Awesome. Now what are we expecting? We are expecting that whatever ID is coming in has to be validated. Okay, so we're gonna delegate the method. I can open this one because that's the reference that we have done, even this one, right? So that's the same pattern. We have done that. This whole method is going to be delegated to this try catch, and then this method is actually this. Hope it out as it's going to be more than one layer. And okay, so what do we do here? We're going to validate it, right? So let's go and say validate just that way if you need. And then what are we going to validate? We're going to validate the ID. Okay, so not all code paths written because initially it was a single line scope. Now this is multi-line. Nice. And this is something that's not written yet. Let's go write it out. Where are we here? Let's go first write our the delegate method, right? So you can think about it if you want to leverage the same delegate method because the return type is, handled well. And then this one takes care of the invalid sample exception. So if you think this is something that will work out, you can still go leverage that try catch. Let's get to the validations layer and check if that is also working fine. So here what we want is we don't want to verify text. We only want to verify ID. We don't want a null. So for sure, we see a need of writing a separate method for the validate ID. So let's say private static void validate input. And then this is going to be ID. It's going to call one line of validate, right? This is invalid of ID, and then my parameter is going to be name of the entity and the attribute. All right, invalid. I think this one's not here. Is it good? Not really. Yeah, I think no. So let's go to this method, and if you see now, this try catch is auto resolved because the contract matched, right? And then this validate input is something we have written here. Okay, so let's get to the test and give it a try. Right click, run test. Should be passing. It's still failing. It says expected invocation once log error. but it's not here. So I said ID is required. Let's check the messaging. Oh, there's a full stop. Nice. It's even capturing tiny details, right? So you can either have a full stop or do not have it. It's up to you. But then the focus is just to have right standard of localization, categorization, and the messaging, right? So let's give it a try here. Right click, run the test. Hopefully, yeah, it's passing. So run code cleanup. And this goes for a pass. Nice. Okay, what is the next test that we would be writing? If you think about it, do we have any other validation test as we are in that category? If we don't have anything, I think it's a good time to move on to the next category. That's going to be our exceptions. So new class, service test dot exceptions dot retrieve by id.cs. Nice. So, and I'm cleaning it out. Okay. So now what are the tests that we have to capture? If we have our dependencies, then we go take a look at the dependency, check what are the tests that they are throwing that we need to capture and go, right? So I think one of our dependency here, let's get here. This is going to be our find. So we can go to our documentation for the list and find and see if we have any exceptions. So I'm just hovering it here, right? What do you see here? It says exception, argument, null exception. So for sure, we're seeing a need for an exception that is being thrown, which we need to capture. So let's go capture that. And this is going to be here. This is a fact. Let me resolve it. So now what I'm going to say is public void. It should throw something. What it should throw? Should throw. It is a dependency, right? The exception is not being thrown by our code, but it is getting thrown by the dependency call. That's a list call, right? So dependency. And what type of exception is this? Argument null exception is something it's trying to validate the input and it is throwing an error. So we can treat that as a validation error. So dependency validation exception on retrieve by ID if you know validation error occurred or input error occurred, whatever invalidation error occurred, and log it. Let's see if it is going beyond 120. Oops, 110. Okay, on the mark. Right. I think the thought process here is it should throw something. What it should throw? It's throwing a dependency validation exception because dependency means it's coming from somewhere else and it's a validation because the input is getting validated. It's not about the connection error or something else that is not related to the input. So when it should do on retrieve by ID if validation error occurred or occurs, whichever works. You want to keep it small. You can have it here. I think occurs is single R. I don't know. If at all you think that's wrong, just do a code up and log it. Okay. Then we go with our given. And then. My scope is again this action, retrieve sample by ID action. And then I'm going to defer the execution. This dot sample service dot retrieve sample by ID. And this is going to be some sample dot ID, right? And let me resolve this one here. And sample sample equal create random sample. Let's get here and take a look at what we have done. So where is this invalid sample getting used? If you take a look, it is just coming from this ID, right? We are not using it anywhere. So there is another option. If you want to do var invalid ID and you say default, you can do this as well. And then you say this is invalid ID, right? Since we are not used, okay, as its default, you cannot have var. So this is going to be an integer. You can try this. I mean, in terms of memory, it's less because you're not creating the whole entity itself. It's just one single variable, right? So you can try this way if you want. I kind of like this since it's using less memory space, right? So let me run this test, run the test. Yeah, it's giving a pass. Let me, check this one in. I'll stage this and say code drop variable, and I'm going to comment. Let me do the same thing for the exceptions. So what I want is some sample ID. Let me take this away. Int some sample ID equal get random number. Since it's an integer, I'm taking it randomly, right? Okay. So now what I want to do, I want to mock as if the exception is getting thrown. So for that, what is the exception that is getting thrown? Argument null exception, right? So var argument null exception equal this. And this is something that I want the dependency call to throw it. So this dot storage broker dot setup broker select. Whenever there's a select call, for what type of input? For any type of input. If you receive a call for any input that is of type integer, you just throw the error. That's all. So here we are. Let me resolve this. This time it is not returns. I want go away. Throws this. I'm going to test as if the dependency is throwing an error. How is my foundation layer? How is my system going to act upon it? Okay. Now, since this is an external error, what we want to do is localize it and then categorize it. So what can I localize it with? I can say var invalid sample argument invalid sample argument exception. And then I say, right, because this is the first time we're going to use invalid sample argument. Let's check if our naming standard is correct. So what we generally do is we say what type of error is it, and then we go with the entity, right? So invalid, or since this is argument null exception, argument null sample exception, you can call it, the idea here is you have the actual error in the fend, and then you have the entity. So invalid argument sample exception. I kind of like this because of the standard that you're following. So invalid argument sample exception. So far what we have done is we've said it's going to be a null sample exception because these are all inner, right? So let me expand the exceptions. So it's failed sample service. So that's the error, and then that's the entity. It's the invalid, that's the error, and then the entity. Null, error, and the entity. Okay, so the same way I'm going to follow here. So I say it's my invalid argument, and then I say sample exception. If you want to be even precise, you can go with null argument sample exception also. So for the simplicity, let's align with this. But later on, if we see a need, then we can generalize it to invalid also. Okay, let's go create this one. Right click, add. This is going to be public because it's going to be accessed outside. And this is of type exception. This is going to take in an inner, right? What is this type? It's a general exception. All argument sample error, but fix the errors and try again. Your exception. Okay, so let's get back here. This has to solve. Okay, now we have localized. This is an external exception. We have localized it. Now let's try and see the wrapper. So the wrapper is going to be dependency validation exception. So the standard for the wrapper is actually, it starts with the entity, right? Since this is our expected, we go with expected. Sample dependency validation exception. This is going to be new sample dependency validation. And then you want to call it as option. Okay, not there yet. All class. Again, this is public exception. Okay, and this is going to take in inner exception, which is our own localizing with this tool. Control dependency validation error occurred. Fix the errors and exception. Get back to the code. Yeah, this is resolved. All fine. Now I go and say assert dot wrapper. So I'm told dependency validation exception of retrieve by ID action. Along with that, I'm expecting it to be logged. So verify broker, and this is going to be an error logging. So log error is this a exception missing parenthesis, same exception as expected, and I want this to be only once. Okay. What are the other things? The core functionality for this particular test is storage broker verify broker dot select. I don't want any input to be passed, right? So I go with this any of it, then times never, because wait. If you take a look at this, where are we throwing the error? The error is being thrown at the broker call. So for sure, this is going to be once, and the order of execution is also going to be at the top. Because this is a mock, right? We are preparing the test as if the broker is throwing the exception and the foundation layer is going to capture. That's why we have the storage broker once and then the logging broker. So as usual in the hierarchy, we'll verify the storage broker first and then logging broker next. Okay, nice. Let's give it a try. Oh, did I say debug? That's fine. I didn't have any breakpoints. It's okay. What did I have? Okay, continue. Continue. Okay, I think it's good that it executed in the breakpoint. So what happened was, since we were sharing the try catch between the add and the retrieve by ID, it actually went to the generic exception because we were not capturing the specific exception, right? So that's why you're able to see this message telling we are expecting dependency validation, but actually the service exception has happened, which is a good thing. So let me analyze, run code cleanup. And then this is going to be my fail test. Okay, so where is the fix? The fix is at the exceptions. What I want to do is catch argument null exception, and this is going to be next. So null argue new. Did I say argument null exception or null argument exception? Okay. You know, we were following that the error is the first thing, right? So invalid, null. So I went with that structure here. Now I'm going to throw something called dependency validation. Create and log dependency validation exception of null argument exception. I think null argument sample exception is more better. Okay. Let's go write this method, which is going to actually wrap it into the dependency. Service dependency. Oh, I missed the service piece. Nice. Let me rename it. This sample dependency validation exception is fine too. I carried away with the previous sample dependency validation exception. Create and log dependency validation. So you're seeing a new bucket, right? So far you've seen sample validation exception as your wrapper, and you have seen sample service exception as your wrapper. So now this is a new wrapper that you're taking a look at. So that's dependency validation. And this is going to be my sample dependency validation exception. All this. Logging broker dot log error of my exception, and then I'm going to return not this variable. Let me check. It's going beyond 120, not really. And the other thing that I would like to do here is move this method here, because just the order of catch is the order of these methods as well. So that's the way I kind of like it. Okay, let's take a look if this is going to be working or not. Now, before the general exception, the actual exception will be caught. Yeah, it worked. Good here. And this is going to be our last test. Okay. With that, I think we have seen a new level of testing here, which is a good thing. The last test that we will be writing, because we have captured all of the possible cases that's here, let's see, service test, which we have already done in the past two workflows of add and retrieve also. Should throw service exception on retrieve by ID if service error occurs and we log it. Okay. My sections are here. Action, retrieve sample by ID action. Test. I am going to write this for the sample service, retrieve sample ID. This time it's nothing invalid, right? So sample ID, some sample ID equal get random number. Okay, now we'll again have to mock as if the exception is being thrown. So var service exception equal new exception. We're going to say this is the general category of exception. As it is again external, we're going to wrap it up. So failed sample service exception equal new. Yeah, we already have it that we have returned in the previous two workflows. Expected don't get carried away with the autocomplete. Expected sample service equal new sample service exception. Okay, we want to throw the error. So what's the dependency that is getting called? First, to throw the error is the storage broker.select with any value, just throw this. That's good. And I is the first one. Okay. Then comes our usual start dot throws sample service exception. And then I'm going to check on the variable where the whole exception is being held. Okay. And then our usual workflow of validating our dependency. That's broker dot it is any of int. I want it to be exact. Or saving the record or retrieving the record, but this is something for the exception that is getting thrown. Broker. Okay, let me go the top. Log error is same. Same. Good. And I'm closing here, closing here, and I say times once. Okay. Order of execution, we're going to verify the calls. Broker. There will really be at one point in time where you stop watching the video, but you actually know what's the next test that is writing. That's actually a good thing. If you feel bored, you're in that stage. You can just stop the video, just go with the coding. And if you're stuck or if you think you want to validate if you're doing it right or not, then you can come back and refer for a pass. With this, with a total of 8 commit, I think in between I did a code drop commit. Otherwise, we are wrapping up our, oh yeah, wait, why is it passing right away with the failed test? Any guesses? Okay, if you have thought about it, we are sharing our try catch, which is already coded for capturing the exception, right? That's the reason. As soon as we wrote the test, it went for a pass. Did I name it pass? Okay, I named it pass. Okay, I'm not sleeping then. Good. So with that, we are wrapping up our foundation layer. And in the next video, we will take a look at the exposure. Thank you for watching.